the previous part of the lecture, we saw that immigration has been an important force shaping society in North America. That part of the lecture focused much more directly on the flow of immigrants from outside North America to the continent. In this last part, we'll look more closely at issues related to the movement of people within North America. In particular, we'll consider migration of workers between Mexico and the United States, and to a lesser degree, migrations to Canada as temporary workers. Near the end of the last part of the lecture, I noted that Mexicans make up the largest immigrant group in the United States. Then I explained that I was speaking of legal immigrants, that is, people who had arrived in the United States in accordance with the established legal processes for obtaining immigration documents. There are, of course, many more people who arrive in the United States without having followed such procedures. The term illegal immigrant is sometimes used in this context, but when you consider all the complicated dimensions of the problems related to work and migration, particularly between Mexico and the United States, I think the term undocumented laborer, worker, or migrant is a more suitable term, so that's the phrase I'm going to use. When Mexico lost much of its northern territory to the United States, remember that the Mexican-American War that we talked about earlier in the course, this did not stop the migration of people. In fact, the migration of Mexicans into territory that was now controlled by the United States increased. And, as a consequence, the area developed a foundation of Latino or Hispanic presence that survived and persisted even in the face of subsequent later waves of European immigration. As is typical with all immigration, there are push and pull factors that contribute to decisions to migrate. In this case, the push factors were typically overpopulation, unemployment, and political repression in Mexico. The pull factors bringing Mexicans to the U.S. were convenience of location, accessibility, cultural similarities, and the opportunity for work. Typically, the new immigrants worked for the railroads, the biggest employer, the large number of expanding factories, and in the developing agricultural regions in Texas and California. It did not take long for the descendants of the earliest Spanish immigrants to be outnumbered by new arrivals from Mexico. Some estimates suggest that up to 1 million Mexican immigrants lived in the U.S. in 1930. Significantly, a pattern of continual movement back and forth across the U.S.-Mexican border took hold. Only the Great Depression of the 1930s slowed it down. Widespread unemployment in the U.S. during the Depression prompted the American government to force hundreds of thousands of Mexicans to return to Mexico between 1929 and 1937. But by then, Mexican culture was very strongly imprinted on the border region. In an early part of the lecture, I noted how important the Latino population is for the United States. Recall that more than 1 in every 8 Americans are of Hispanic origin. In other words, they are the largest ethnic minority in the states. These statistics, however, don't take into account the number of undocumented migrants. Estimates of undocumented immigration to the U.S. vary wildly, ranging from 7 to 30 million people. The most credible numbers would seem to suggest a number somewhere between 10 and 13 million is likely most accurate. One study carried out about a decade ago suggested 57% of undocumented immigrants came from Mexico, and a further 24% were from other Latin American countries. This would compare with 6% from Europe and Canada. Since about the 1980s, American governments have increasingly focused their attention on this population of undocumented immigrants, mostly in response to wider public expressions of concern over their social and economic impact. And often these concerns were expressed in starkly racist terms. The Immigration Reform and Control Act, passed in 1986, was one of the first attempts to address this issue with legislation. A very complicated law, it did allow for the possibility of amnesty and legal residence for undocumented migrants who had been in the U.S. since 1982. But it also introduced sanctions on employers who hired undocumented migrants. In effect, employers were expected to enforce immigration laws. 3 million people applied for legal status, but the employer sanctions part of the law failed to achieve the results the government had hoped for. Undocumented workers continued to find jobs. The state of California also attempted to take action against undocumented migrants. In 1994, voters there passed Proposition 187, also known as the Save Our State Initiative, in a referendum. In effect, it called for a state-run citizenship screening system that would prevent undocumented migrants from receiving health care, public education, and other social services in the state. Though passed, the law was immediately challenged in the courts. There, it ran into difficulties on the grounds that it was unconstitutional, and by 1999, the law was effectively dead when the state government finally decided not to continue its legal appeals to maintain the law. Immigration reform has continued to be a very hot political issue in the United States. Anti-immigrant bashing in certain political and social circles, including some mainstream media, is common. But this is increasingly confronted by activism and protests by and on behalf of undocumented workers. In Congress, the House of Representatives has tended to take positions that would see immigration curtailed and have illegal border crossing declared a felony. The Senate, however, has tended to favor solutions that would develop guest worker programs and the gradual legalization of undocumented workers. In 2006, Congress passed legislation that was signed by President George W. Bush that mandated the construction of a wall to stop Mexican workers from crossing the border without valid papers. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security has since built more than 500 kilometers of fence along the U.S.-Mexican border, mainly in New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Some construction is underway in Texas, too. Proposition 187 and laws to build fences along the border appeal to the segment of public opinion in the U.S. that is concerned by undocumented immigration. Typically, these sentiments against undocumented workers are highest where unemployment is also high. Here, you tend to hear arguments such as illegal immigrants are taking away our jobs. Interestingly, though, many businesses, and those in the agricultural sector in particular, will argue that these workers are needed to fill jobs that would be seen as unattractive employment to Americans. And on some level, Americans as a whole seem to agree with that. A 2006 poll found that 53% of Americans agreed that undocumented workers took jobs Americans don't want. Yet, some economists suggest that the increased supply of labor provided by undocumented workers has a tendency to lessen the bargaining power of American workers, drawing down wages overall. Yet again, though, without undocumented labor, others suggest it wouldn't be possible to produce the same volume of food at the same cost. Clearly, it's a messy issue. In fact, it's so complicated that even President Obama, who seemed very keen to find a resolution to this issue when he first took office, has found it just as bedeviling as it ever was. To end this part of the lecture, I'd like to briefly touch on Canada. Clearly, geography has meant that undocumented workers from Mexico are much less an issue in this country than has been the case in the US. A more relevant but related issue in this part of the continent is temporary workers. For decades, Canada has used temporary foreign worker programs to fill employment gaps in the economy. Again, typically work that Canadians would find unappealing or not lucrative enough. To give you some sense of the scale here, more than 192,000 temporary foreign workers came to Canada in 2011. Less than 30,000 of these would transition to permanent resident status as immigrants. So they truly are here on a temporary, if recurring, basis. In other words, as important as immigration has been for Canada, the increased use of temporary foreign workers has now become even more prevalent than permanent immigration. In a country like Canada, that is also demographically dependent upon immigration to maintain a stable population base, the implications of this shift towards temporary workers has not been well considered or thought through, particularly by the public at large. Instead, the public has tended to react to increased media coverage of temporary workers by resorting to familiar refrains of concern over jobs being taken away from Canadians. This issue, though not as prominent in Canadian political discourse as are undocumented workers in the US, is likely to become of increasing importance in the northern part of the continent in years ahead. This ends part 4 of our lecture on labor and immigration. I hope the lecture has helped you to recognize some of the complexity surrounding so many of the issues related to something even as simple as how and where people work in North America. We'll see you in class. Attempted to take action against undocumented